They're mining the ocean floor, and nobody's stopping them. The water turns chocolate brown 1,000 meters down. Lights catch a drifting blizzard. Then the camera finds it, a slow-moving machine chewing the seafloor and a shrimp the size of a fingernail tumbling end over end in the plume. A radio crackles, flow is stable, and the operator nods. He doesn't see the sea cucumber vanish in the wake. 2 years earlier, executives pitched this as the clean future. Metals for EVs without the blood and smoke of landmines. Governments nodded. Permits advanced. But there was one problem nobody wanted to talk about, what these nodules really were and who would pay their true cost. The treasure on the seafloor. Manganese, nodules, and metals. To understand why a machine is grinding a desert of darkness into slurry, we need to go back, half a world and millions of years, to a small stone growing grain by grain. It's called a polymetallic nodule. It doesn't look like treasure, more like a bruised potato. But inside that potato is a cocktail of metals the energy transition craves. Manganese, nickel, cobalt, copper. Not specs, percentages. Enough that companies mapped a patch of the Pacific between Hawaii and Mexico, the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, or CCZ, and started seeing dollar signs across 4.5 million square kilometers. Here's where it gets crazy. These nodules don't form in years or centuries. They accrete at millimeters per million years around whatever seed the abyss gives them, sometimes a shark tooth. A human lifetime isn't even a blink in their schedule. The nodules become real estate. Sponges and corals anchor to them. Octopuses lay eggs on them. Microbes build cities in their pores. Take the nodule, you take the neighborhood. That's not a metaphor. It's the literal habitat. Meanwhile, on land, the story people tell goes like this. We need batteries, batteries need metals, and terrestrial mines are a mess. Forests raised in Indonesia for nickel, cobalt linked to conflict and abuse in the DRC, tailings ponds, sulfuric acid, and thick smoke. So the pitchlands harvest nodules on a flat, life-poor plain, lift them with pumps, and refine them with fewer scars. The metals are just lying there. But they aren't just lying there. They are arranged in slow-motion ecosystems that don't bounce back on policy timelines. The International Union for Conservation of Nature spells it out. Disturbing the seafloor destroys habitat. Damage is likely permanent. Add sediment plumes that can drift for hundreds of kilometers, smother filter feeders, and interrupt the deep ocean's quiet conversation of light and sound. Mining ships discharge wastewater back into the mid-water twilight zone, where zooplankton feed the entire food web. Replace their dinner with grit, and the chain weakens. That's not a theory. A 2022 trial showed plume discharge can disrupt midwater food webs. While that was happening in the CCZ, another clock started ticking. In 2021, Nauru triggered a clause at the International Seabed Authority, the 2-year rule, pressing the regulator to finalize mining rules. The deadline slid by, regulations still unfinished. Yet the exploration grid kept expanding, and companies said they'd be ready to mine as soon as regulators said go, maybe even sooner. Pacific communities watch the map overlap with their future. Not abstract lines, tuna grounds. Studies show big ice, skipjack, and yellowfin are shifting east under warming seas, increasing overlap with mining leases. For some island nations, tuna access fees are a third of government revenue. If plumes intersect spawning or migration corridors, the hit won't be measured in kilograms of metal, but in school fees, hospital lights, and dinner. The stakes then aren't nodules versus nickel ore. They're whose risk gets counted. Landmines leave visible wounds. Raised hills displaced families, black streams. Deep sea mining proposes hidden harm, muffled noise across the water column, dust storms in darkness, habitats vacuumed into hoppers. Governments are being told this is the lesser evil. But that framing leaves out a third path already in motion: redesign, reuse, and recycling. The IUCN calls for circular strategies before opening the abyss. Battery recycling is scaling, with recovery of nickel, cobalt, and lithium already commercial. New chemistries like sodium ion are pushing into storage and low-cost mobility, reducing pressure on cobalt and nickel entirely. None of this is magic. It's engineering and policy. And it undercuts the sales line that the ocean must be sacrificed for climate. Get this, Canada bans deep-sea mining in its own waters under its Fisheries Act, concerned about harmful discharges, while Canadian-founded firms seek licenses overseas. Papua New Guinea's first major deep-sea mining venture collapsed into bankruptcy after community resistance and shaky assessments. In Australia's Northern Territory, a permanent ban stands. Across the Pacific, Church leaders, fishers, and elders call for a moratorium, not because they're anti-tech, but because their lives are pegged to an ocean whose rhythms they understand better than any spreadsheet. What nobody knew at the time of those early investor decks was how much the midwater mattered to everything above it. Micronectin rising each night to feed, zooplankton filtering the ocean's snow, carbon dropping in fragile pellets. Stir that column, you don't just annoy shrimp, you play with a planet-scale conveyor. Scientists warn of ripple effects we can't model yet. Meanwhile, exploration contractors test collectors like the Patania II, crawl a few kilometers, and declare minimal impact, even as they admit they can't see beyond the lights. This was the moment everything changed for our story, when treasure stopped meaning metals and started meaning time. Time to finish the science. Time to weigh the true costs against the marketed benefits. Time to ask whether the green transition has to repeat the old pattern, wealth to a few, risk to the many, damage off ledger, just because the harm is out of sight. To understand the deception here, you don't need a villain twirling a mustache. You need incentives, governments with budget gaps, corporations with SPAC clocks, a regulator with 169 member states and a mandate to both enable and protect. Nodules that look inert to anyone who hasn't watched a ghostly octopus wrap its eggs around one. And a simple, quiet fact. Once you vacuum 1,000,000 years off the seafloor, you can't return it with a memo. The tiny regulator with global power, the ISA. Unknown to most people on land, there's a small office in Kingston, Jamaica, with a mandate that stretches across nearly half the planet. The International Seabed Authority, 169 member states, a few floors of meeting rooms, and a job that sounds impossible: regulate mining in the part of the ocean that belongs to no single country. Under the law of the sea, that seabed is the common heritage of humankind. The ISA is supposed to make sure it stays that way. Benefits shared, science supported, environment protected. Here's the twist. The ISA also has to enable extraction. It writes the rules that could let machines roll across abyssal plains. It awards exploration contracts, 31 by mid-2022, covering more than 1.5 million square kilometers, and it's drafting the mining code that would govern exploitation. It's a split personality baked into law: open the door and guard it. 3 years earlier, something unusual happened. In June 2021, Nauru, sponsoring a contractor tied to the metals company, pulled a lever in the treaty called the 2-year rule. It told the council, finish the regulations in 2 years because we intend to apply to mine. The intent was clear: create a clock, force a decision. Staff scrambled, committees formed, red lines multiplied. The deadline passed in July 2023 with no final rulebook. But the pressure worked. Negotiations accelerated. The council aimed to wrap in 2025 if the text was ready. Companies told investors they were ready, too. From the outside, it looked like a technical debate. Royalty rates, environmental baselines, plume thresholds. Inside the room, delegates were juggling more than clauses. Small island states were thinking about tuna, tourism, and sovereignty. European countries weighed green industrial ambitions against public opposition. Nations with contractors wanted certainty. Others wanted time. Scientists kept reminding everyone that the deep sea remains poorly understood, that impacts could be permanent, that baseline data is thin. Meanwhile, something else was happening. A chorus was growing for a moratorium or precautionary pause. It wasn't just NGOs anymore. Governments from the Pacific and beyond stood up in council sessions and said, "We're not ready." The IUCN had already called for a halt unless strict conditions were met: comprehensive risk understanding, transparent assessments, polluter pays, circular economy first. That language filtered into national position. And then, far from Kingston, bans appeared. Australia's Northern Territory, multiple US states. Canada's Fisheries Act kept domestic waters off limits. The ISA felt like a pressure cooker with vents opening elsewhere. To understand the ISA, you follow the incentives. Contractors need clarity to secure financing. Sponsor states, often small, sometimes economically stressed, see a pathway to revenue and influence. Larger powers see supply chains and strategic metals. The Secretariat has to shepherd a process that keeps all sides at the table. And hanging over everything is a legal principle that sounds noble and is hard to implement. The common heritage must benefit all humanity. How do you quantify all when the impacts are local and the metals go to factories far away? What nobody in those negotiating rooms could ignore was the optics of speed. The trigger created an artificial deadline. It also created suspicion. Was the clock about science or share prices? When a contractor suggested it might pursue a national permit elsewhere, bypassing the ISA, the Secretary General called it a violation of international law. That flare-up told you how brittle the consensus was. If the authority splinters, the whole promise of a shared seabed collapses into a race. At the same time, the ISA really is tiny for what it's tasked to do. A handful of technical staff must review complex environmental plans, run compliance, and referee an industry that can outspend them on consultants. Delegates rotate. Knowledge walks out with elections. The Legal and Technical Commission, charged with reviewing applications, meets behind closed doors. Transparency advocates argue that's untenable for a public trust. Contractors argue proprietary data needs protection. That tension shows up in every draft paragraph. From the perspective of Pacific communities, the power dynamics are stark. A map drawn in Kingston can overlap with livelihoods in Kiribati, Tonga, and the Cook Islands. A sediment plume modeled on a slide could drift across migration routes that pay for nurses and textbooks. If things go wrong, who is liable? How do you prove harm 4,000 meters down? The liability chapter of the mining code remains one of the hardest knots. Without it, effective protection is a promise without teeth. And yet, the ISA is also where caution can win. In marathon sessions, delegates have inserted stronger environmental language, debated adaptive management, demanded robust baselines, and acknowledged knowledge gaps. The Council has not rubber-stamped exploitation. The Assembly has heard loudly the case for a pause. If you strip away the corporate decks and the activist banners, you're left with a real question in a small building. Can a global regulator resist manufactured urgency and force industry to meet the highest bar before moving? Back in the CCZ, collectors keep crawling in tests, cameras roll, and the snow keeps falling through the water column. In Kingston, pens hover over brackets. The ISA was designed to balance promise and protection. What it decides next will tell us which word mattered more. The players, countries, corporations, and billionaires. While delegates argue commas in Kingston, the real momentum comes from people with balance sheets and election calendars. Start with the sponsor states. Nauru, Tonga, and Kiribati are small on the map, but central to this story. Each sponsors a contractor tied to the metals company, a Canadian-founded firm promising to turn potato-sized rocks into climate salvation and national revenue. For leaders managing narrow budgets and climate threats, sponsorship fees and a slice of future royalties look like a bridge. Yet at home, church coalitions, fishers, and elders warn that a bad bet at 4,000 meters could undercut tuna and tourism for generations. That tension, cash now versus ocean forever, sits in every cabinet meeting. Then there are the Cook Islands, rich in nodules inside their own EEZ and eager to define responsible seabed activities on their terms. They've issued exploration licenses, pitched rigorous oversight, and faced the same divide. Economic sovereignty on one side, precaution on the other. Across the Tasman, Australia's Northern Territory took the opposite path, banned seabed mining outright, after a 9-year campaign led by traditional owners, fishers, tourism operators, and scientists. That decision echoes in Pacific capitals. If a wealthy jurisdiction says the risk isn't worth it, why should island states carry it? Meanwhile, Canada plays a split role. Its Fisheries Act effectively blocks deep-sea mining domestically because of harmful discharge risks, but Canadian-linked companies were first movers abroad. Nautilus Minerals tried to launch the Solwara 1 project off Papua New Guinea, promising jobs and minimal impact. It collapsed in debt and lawsuits, leaving coastal communities with no benefit and a sour lesson. The social license is the mine. That failure didn't end the pitch, it refined it. New deck stress, lower impact, metals from nodules, and cleaner supply chains. The label changed. The underlying incentive stayed the same. Corporate names rotate, but the model repeats. Global Sea Mineral Resources out of Belgium tested the Patania II collector and told the world impacts were manageable. Their data comes from narrow corridors in a vast, variable system, and it travels with NDAs. The metals company tells investors it will deliver nickel, cobalt, and manganese at scale, with lower carbon intensity than rainforest mining. Their critics ask about plume spread, mid-water discharge, and baseline data gaps. Both agree on one thing: the ISA must move. One needs rules to raise money. The other needs time to keep asking hard questions. Hover over all of this and you find the battery economy. Car makers and electronics giants don't want headlines about child labor in cobalt or rivers turned yellow by laterite nickel. They want responsible sourcing badges that hold up under scrutiny. Some back recycling plants and traceability schemes. Others watch seabed metals as a potential hedge. The irony is sharp. The more investors worry about terrestrial abuses, the more compelling the ocean looks if you accept a narrow frame that counts trees and ignores abyssal life. But there's another current, chemistry and circularity. Battery makers are shifting into nickel-light or nickel-free chemistries for segments that don't need long range. Sodium-ion, cheap, safe, and unburdened by cobalt, has moved from labs into early factories, especially for grid storage and short-range mobility. At the same time, recycling is scaling, with commercial plants recovering high shares of nickel and cobalt from scrap and end-of-life packs. None of this erases raw material demand, but it does bend the curve. Every percentage point of recycled content, every chemistry that skips cobalt, chips away at the argument that the CCZ must be open tomorrow. Now add the billionaire factor, not as cartoon villains, but as amplifiers. Venture funds chase narratives with steep curves, first-mover advantage, trillion-dollar TAMs, SPAC pathways. A company that can claim exclusive access to a new resource class, metals for the energy transition lying untapped on the seafloor, fits the slide. The clock starts at listing, not at science. Quarterly calls don't wait for ecosystem baseline. When timelines slip, pressure leaks into policy. Urge the ISA to finalize, hint at national workarounds, frame delays as threats to climate goals. It's not an evil plan, it's how finance behaves when promises face friction. On the other side, philanthropy-backed ocean groups build coalitions that look soft until they land. Pacific civil society links hands with European ministers and US states passing bans. Scientists publish on midwater food webs and tuna overlap with mining contracts. A phrase, precautionary pause, moves from NGO memos into national statements. Suddenly, the inevitable industry looks conditional. The hallways in Kingston feel that shift. And yet, the biggest player might be climate itself. As the Pacific warms, tuna move east, pushing the economic center of gravity across lines drawn for mining exploration. If sediment plumes and noise meet stressed stocks and shifting spawning grounds, losses won't show up on mining P and LS. They'll show up in missing access fees that fund Pacific schools and clinics. Which makes the real choice clearer. Who carries the risk when two ocean industries collide? Strip away the logos and here's the cast. Small nations with everything at stake, corporations with machines in the water and investors at their backs, regulators with thin capacity and a heavy mandate, and a global audience that wants clean tech without dirty secrets. Each believes they're acting rationally. The question is whether their combined rationality adds up to wisdom, or to a plume nobody can stop once the pumps switch on. How you mine an abyss? Machines, plumes, and noise. To pull metal out of a place where sunlight never arrives, you start with a crawler. Think industrial Roomba scaled to a small house, armored against pressure, tracked like a tank. It inches across the abyssal plain, a front-end mouth scooping polymetallic nodules and the thin skin of sediment around them. Rotors churn, sieves rattle, pumps breathe. Everything the machine swallows mixes with seawater into slurry. That's the point. What nodules don't give up in speed, engineers reclaim in volume. The crawler isn't alone. Above it, a riser pipe as wide as a man's torso snakes 4,000 meters up to a ship. High-pressure pumps staged along the pipe lift the slurry like an elevator made of water and grit. The ship, a factory in waves, separates nodules from mud, stockpiles rock for transshipment, and here's the part the sails decks blur, discharges processed water back into the ocean. Not at the surface. That would create an obvious slick and clog intakes. The plan is to send it back down into the midwater twilight, dense enough to sink, distant enough to hide. Meanwhile, sensors blink constantly. The machine's weight crushes centimeters into a seafloor that's taken millennia to stabilize. As it crawls, a sediment plume blooms behind it, fine particles buoyed by the smallest turbulence. It looks like a fog bank in slow motion. In lab tanks, plumes settle in minutes. In the deep, with currents you can't see and particles you barely can, they can drift for kilometers, maybe hundreds, resuspending when eddies pass. Filter feeders, sponges, brittle stars, corals don't choke immediately. They clog, they starve, they stop reproducing. Now add the midwater discharge. That plume is different, colder, denser, loaded with tiny particles and trace metals, expelled under pressure into a zone crowded with life we rarely film: zooplankton, micronectin, small squid, lanternfish. These animals are the elevator of life, rising at night to feed and sinking by day, hauling carbon downward in a quiet rain. Replace their food with silt and metal-laced fines, and you don't just irritate them, you tilt a food web. A recent trial in the CCZ showed exactly that risk. Discharge can disrupt mid-water food webs where the ocean's base calories are made and traded. Noise rides shotgun. The crawler hums and grinds. The pumps thrum like engines heard through walls. The ship adds its constant mechanical heartbeat. Sound moves differently under pressure. Low frequencies travel far. What starts as industrial noise becomes a curtain laid across a territory where whales navigate, squid communicate with subtle movements, and fish school by sensing vibration. Deep-sea creatures evolved in near silence, punctuated by the occasional crack or song. Continuous machine tone is new. You won't see it on an impact map. You'll hear it if you're a whale migrating across the line where contracts begin. Here, where engineering pride meets ecological math. Contractors say they'll minimize plumes with skirts around intakes, tune discharge to currents, and cap noise with dampers. Some measures will help, but the physics doesn't bend to promises. Scraping releases sediment, pumping creates turbulence, separating slurry creates waste, and scale multiplies everything. A single test track might look tidy. A commercial field with multiple collectors operating around the clock for months turns tidy into weather. Sheets and billows of fine material moving beyond the light cones of any camera a company can afford to drop. Follow the path of what's taken. Nodules go to deck, then to barges, then to smelters on land, because there's no refinery at sea. The ship keeps the crawler fed with power sent down the riser and instructions sent through fiber and acoustic links. When the crawler stalls on an unseen rock, the operator leans forward in a dark room a hemisphere away and eases the machine free. When the slurry thickens, pumps strain and alarms chirp. This is mining by latency, where the site is remote but the urgency feels close. Another reason timelines press and shortcuts tempt. Meanwhile, look at what's left behind. The track isn't just a path, it's a strip mine etched into silt. Everything that used the nodules as anchor points loses purchase. Eggs laid on hard surfaces lift into the plume. Microbial mats that tune to the chemistry of nodule skins disperse with no place to return. Recovery, where it happens, follows geologic time, not human time. If you're measuring quarterly, a year looks like a breath. If you're measuring the return of a habitat, a century looks like a hope. Engineers talk about adaptive management: monitor, adjust, reduce. That makes sense when you can see cause and effect quickly. In the deep sea, feedback is delayed and diffuse. If a plume suppresses feeding at 800 meters, the signal might appear as a shift in fish growth rates a basin away next season. If noise scrambles cetacean routes, strandings might rise on a coast that never heard of the CCZ. The accountability loop stretches until it breaks, and still the machine moves. Operators tick through checklists, pumps recover. The ship's discharge valves open again with a hiss. The abyss takes another breath of silt. Above, a school of tuna chases lanternfish that didn't rise tonight. Unknown to them across town, Kingston, the wording for acceptable plume is still in brackets. What lives down there? Unknown worlds, known risks. To grasp what the crawler drags through, you start with a light and a minute of patience. The beam lands on a desert, and then the desert moves. Brittle stars spiderwalk between nodules. A Dumbo octopus hovers, ear-like fins pulsing, inspecting a nodule that to her is a nursery. Sponge stalks rise like glass chandeliers, fed by currents so faint they look like thought. Each hard lump is a neighborhood. Microbes layered like cities, chemical gradients as precise as recipes, larvae tucked into pores waiting for a cue we don't hear. Meanwhile, something else is happening in the dark above. Zooplankton graze the slow snow drifting down from surface life. Micronectin, shrimps, tiny fishes, squids spend the day at depth and commute nightly toward starlight, hauling carbon down when they sink again. It's the planet's most reliable elevator. The nodules don't run that system, but they stabilize the ground floor. Disturb the base, scrape anchors, fog the water with silt, and the elevator stutters. What nobody says in investor decks is how new this knowledge is. The CCZ is Yellowstone. It's more like a library we just found the door to. Scientists are still writing the first catalog. Expeditions turn up species nobody has seen, many living only there. That's not romance, that's sampling reality at abyssal depth. when the International Union for Conservation of Nature warns that damage from mining could be permanent, they're not speculating. They're looking at growth rates measured in millimeters per million years and life histories, tied to things that don't regrow on human time. Here, S where the unknown cuts both ways. Industry says uncertainty justifies learn by doing. But uncertainty is precisely why caution exists in law. We don't know plumes spread at commercial scale, noise footprints under full fleets, or how mid-water discharge shifts food webs season to season. A University of Hawaii-led study flagged that discharge could disrupt the twilight zone, the zone that feeds everything above. That's a red light, not a yellow. You don't reroute a city's food supply to test traffic flow. And yet, the deep sea isn't fragile in the way a coral reef is fragile. It's robust in its own slow rhythm. It can handle a storm of marine snow, a whale fall, a century of calm. What it doesn't handle well is industrial continuity, machines running 24/7 over months across grids. The difference between a disturbance and a regime is scale and repetition. A single track might heal in patches. A checkerboard of harvest blocks becomes a landscape with its bones removed. Let's drop to creature level. A sponge anchored to a nodule doesn't relocate when its rock disappears. An octopus laying eggs on a firm surface can't switch to mud. Sea cucumbers that sift thin layers of sediment don't thrive under blankets. Microbes adapted to nodule chemistry can't conjure a new city on slurry. Recovery depends on hard substrate returning, and that substrate is what the business plan ships away. Now pan out. Whales don't live at 4,000 meters, but they cross above. Lanternfish school along isotherms that run like invisible highways. Tuna chase the dusk migration where bait should be. Add the projected eastward shift of big-eye, skipjack, and yellowfin under warming seas into the same coordinates that hold mining leases, and you have overlap with cash flow for Pacific states. That's not a moral claim, it's a budget line. If the twilight zone thins, if bait is off schedule, tuna catches and access fees wobble. Scientists are careful. Correlation isn't causation, but management has to be conservative when the grocery store is the treasury. There's also the carbon story no one can film. The deep ocean stores it in cold, pressure, and time. The biological pump depends on pellets sinking, on particles aggregating, on quiet layers staying quiet. Sediment plumes add fine particles that ride currents longer, keeping carbon suspended where it can be respired back to CO2. The scale of that feedback is still in journals and models, not headlines. That's the point. You don't wait for headlines to protect a system this central. Meanwhile, the ISA's own premise says the seabed beyond borders is the common heritage of humankind. Heritage isn't just metal, it's living archives, species, interactions, services we barely name. A heritage you liquidate before inventory isn't stewardship, it's a clearance sale. So what lives down there? Things with faces and things without. Animals that look like cartoons and microbes that run chemistry nobody's patented. Worlds within grains and migrations that lace the Pacific together. Known risks, habitat loss that doesn't reverse, plumes that travel beyond sight, noise that turns a soundscape into machinery, food webs thinned in the very zone that feeds the surface. Unknowns, the full cascade, which is precisely why the smartest move is time. Time to learn without the crawler running, time to scale what reduces demand up here, and time to resist the oldest urge in extraction. To move first and measure harm later. The scarcity story, the battery metals panic. While collectors crept across the abyss, a different machine was running on land fear. The pitch was simple, the world's going electric, metals are finite, China dominates refining, and if we don't open new frontiers now, the transition stalls. Scarcity as storyline, urgency as leverage. Get this, some of it is true. Demand for nickel, cobalt, manganese, and copper has surged with EVs, storage, and grids. Supply chains are concentrated. China refines the bulk of critical minerals and leads in battery manufacturing. Policymakers see risk in those choke points. Investors see upside in anything that promises fresh supply fast. Into that anxiety, seabed metals arrive like destiny, a new continent of resources. But look closer at how scarcity gets framed. It lumps every segment, phones, buses, grid batteries, into one giant, uniform appetite for the same metals forever. It ignores how fast chemistries shift. In the last 5 years, car makers and cell producers have pushed hard into nickel-light and nickel-free chemistries for segments that don't need 600-mile range. LFP took share without Cobalt. Now sodium-ion is stepping in for entry EVs and grid storage, cheap, stable, and unburdened by cobalt and nickel. China's giants have announced mass production paths. Early packs are already shipping. That doesn't erase metal's demand, but it changes the slope. Meanwhile, recycling grew up while headlines chased the CCZ. First came scrap from gigafactories. Now end-of-life packs are arriving in volume. Commercial plants in Asia, Europe, and North America are recovering high shares of nickel, cobalt, and lithium from shredded black mass, then refining to battery-grade material. Targets in Europe require recycled content and rising recovery rates. Analysts model tens of billions in annual value by the 2030s and major contributions to supply, especially for cobalt and nickel. This isn't boutique, it's industry scaffolding. So why does the panic persist? Follow the incentives. New mining narratives attract capital. SPACs and growth funds prefer a frontier to a factory retrofit. Untapped metals on the seafloor sounds bigger than optimized cathode supply with recycled feedstock. And geopolitical anxiety is real. Governments want domestic supply or at least less dependence on a single refiner. Opening the ocean becomes a sovereign impulse dressed as climate necessity. There's also a sleight of hand in the math. You'll see charts projecting metal demand through 2050 if the world electrifies everything using today's chemistries and today's recycling rates. Then the conclusion: yawning gaps only mining can fill, but change is the constant in batteries. Cycle life rises, energy density edges up, second life use expands, and recycling scales with the same S-curves that drove solar and wind. Policy accelerates it. Extended producer responsibility, recycled content mandates, design for disassembly. These turn someday into compliance. What nobody in the scarcity slide decks highlights is timing asymmetry. The riskiest period is the next decade, when EV adoption spikes and recycling feedstock is still maturing. That's the window companies use to argue for seabed mining. But that window can be bridged with a portfolio, expand refining with higher environmental standards, diversify terrestrial supply away from the most destructive routes, speed urban mining, and push cobalt and nickel-like chemistries where they fit. Every percentage point shaved off primary demand reduces the argument for opening a biome we barely understand. Meanwhile, the landmines are worse. Claim hides its own cherry-picking. Yes, laterite nickel in rainforests carries brutal carbon and biodiversity costs. Life cycle work in Indonesia pegs nickel at roughly 7.9, 4 kg of Kotwi per kg of metal just from land use change and processing choices. Cobalt in the DRC, source of roughly 3/4 of global supply, ties to abuse and corruption, especially in artisanal stream. Those impacts are unacceptable and solvable with hard governance. No-go zones, traceability, labor enforcement, and shifting demand toward lower-impact sources and chemistries. Framing the choice as rainforest devastation or abyssal plains vacuumed clean is an industry convenience, not a law of physics. There's another piece: resilience. A system dependent on a few refineries is fragile. A system that adds a new frontier with novel, poorly understood risks isn't resilient by default. Real resilience comes from diversification in chemistry, geography, and material flows. Scrap becomes stock. End of life becomes feedstock. Sodium covers use cases that don't need high energy density. That mosaic beats a single bet on a place we can't fix once broken. Scarcity, then, isn't a lie, it's a lens. It can be focused to justify whichever project sits on an investor's desk, or widened to include tools that cut demand and multiply supply paths without turning the deep ocean into an industrial district. The panic version skips the second set because it doesn't raise money as fast. The sober version asks a simpler question: do we have to gamble a million-year habitat to solve a 5 to 15-year bottleneck? Back in Kingston, brackets around precautionary aren't just legalese. They're a test of whether the scarcity story runs the room. If urgency becomes a cudgel, the crawler wins by default. If urgency becomes a design brief, we build our way out on land, in labs, and through loops without adding a plume to the twilight. The marketing machine. Green metals and lobby playbooks. While engineers perfected crawlers, another engine revved in boardrooms, the story machine. Green metals became the headline. The pitch was clean air in cities powered by minerals gently collected from a flat, life-poor seabed. Landmines had villains, nodules had sunsets, and dolphins swimming past a ship's silhouette. It wasn't science, it was framing, pain traded for promise, out of sight, out of mind. Get this, their playbook hits the same notes every time. First, inevitability. The energy transition can't happen without these metals. That line folds every use case into one bucket and treats chemistry innovation and recycling as footnotes. It also makes delay feel reckless. Second, lesser evil. Slides linger on rainforests raised for laterite nickel and headlines about abuses in cobalt supply chains, then jump to a crawler gliding over barren plains. The missing cut is what we covered. Nodules as habitat, plumes in the twilight zone, and timescales no ESG report can fix. Third, borrowed authority. Contractors sponsor research cruises, wrap logos around ROVs, and seed talking points with phrases like independent baseline. The findings, often narrow. A short track, a few sensors, a modeled plume with tidy edges. The footnotes mention limitations, the press releases don't. When scientists publish work that complicates the story, midwater food web disruption from discharge, tuna overlap with licenses, the response shifts to will mitigate and adaptive management. If you can't promise no harm, promise control. Meanwhile, the lobby map lights up. In Kingston, delegates meet in rooms where contractors hold side events with coffee and calm certainty. In capitals, consultants remind ministers that supply chains are geopolitical, that China dominates refining, that being resource independent sounds good in a campaign. Position papers land on desks. Mining the CCZ lowers carbon intensity, spreads benefits to sponsor states, and supports climate targets. The caveat, if regulation lands quickly, is the quiet ask. Speed is the product. Then there's the credibility laundering. Common heritage of humankind becomes a tagline next to a render of a nodule on a velvet backdrop. ESG brochures talk about sharing benefits with Pacific communities, with images of smiling fishers on sunlit piers. Sponsorship fees get framed as development partnerships. Meanwhile, church coalitions and local leaders calling for a moratorium are labeled anti-progress. As if asking for time is a luxury island nations can afford but somehow don't deserve. Inside the corporate decks, you see another lever, climate guilt. If we delay, coal stays longer. It's a clever binary. It ignores the portfolio that actually retires coal faster, cheaper storage chemistries, grid build-out, recycling to keep cathode plants fed, and reforms that cut the worst terrestrial mining routes. It asks policymakers to weigh a hypothetical benefit against concrete, understudied harm. When pressed on the unknowns, the answer returns to pilot responsibly. Pilots are small, markets aren't. Watch how the language shifts under scrutiny. Barren plain becomes low productivity habitat. Minimal impact becomes acceptable impact. Discharge water becomes clarified return water. Words are engineered to sound like control. Even the machines get names that soften edges, collectors, harvesters, never dredges. A dredge destroys, a harvester tends. The marketing prefers the farmer's hat to the miner's helmet. The money story threads through it all. SPAC timelines turn into public pressure. Tell investors mining starts by X, then retrofit public narratives to hit milestones. If the ISA process slows, hint at alternative pathways. Float national permits or legacy laws. Frame international law as evolving. When the Secretary General calls that out as unlawful, claim misinterpretation. Keep the clock loud. Meanwhile, the counter-narrative learns to talk like finance. Not just save the deep, but risk management. Point to regulatory uncertainty, liability gaps, reputational exposure for carmakers, and the real possibility of stranded assets if bans spread. Show the economics of recycling curves, recovery rates, and policy mandates. Note how sodium-ion eats the low-end market, shaving cobalt and nickel demand where seabed metals were supposed to shine. That's not romance. It's displacing revenue. What nobody in the green metals campaign admits is the asymmetry of proof. A few clean years of operations won't prove safety in a system that moves on decadal scales. One mistake, one plume that rides a current into a spawning layer, one noise curtain that pushes cetaceans off a corridor will prove harm people can measure. Insurance doesn't cover trust, so the machine keeps selling calm, rendered seas, gentle robots, a future where your EV is ocean positive. The test is whether the story is slick. It's whether the facts underneath can carry its weight. When a habitat takes 1,000,000 years to form, a slogan can carry exactly none. The tests and the mess. Evidence from trials. 3 days earlier, something strange occurred on a calm patch of the Pacific. A research winch came up coated in fine brown film. Not mud from the bottom. This was midwater discharge drifting like talc at 800 meters. On deck, a biologist rubbed it between her fingers and said quietly, "This is their plume." Trials were supposed to be clean rehearsals, limited kilometers, short windows, lots of sensors. Companies needed proof of minimal impact. Scientists needed data at real scales. What they got was a picture with edges missing, and the edges mattered most. Take the Patania II collector tests. The machine crawled narrow corridors, lifted nodules, and left tidy tracks the length of a city block. Instruments registered a near-field plume that settled faster than expected. Press releases leaned on that line, but the sampling halo was small, the current weak, and the timelines short. Outside the light cone, particles as fine as smoke kept moving, resuspending when currents shifted, settling unevenly on animals that don't rinse. The cameras couldn't follow. The NDAs wouldn't let raw data roam. Meanwhile, a separate campaign focused on the other plume, the one nobody sees in promo reels. Discharge from the ship was released into the twilight zone. Zooplankton nets came up with diets diluted by inedible fines. Lab work showed junk food effects. Animals filled stomachs with particles that carried little energy and potential metal traces. Micronectin that should have been dense at dusk thinned. The headline wasn't dramatic, it was worse. Discharge can disrupt mid-water food webs. The elevator that feeds everything above. On the bottom, micro-experiments mimic disturbance. Scientists dragged small plows through nodule fields and revisited sites years later. The result was a lesson in time. Tracks stayed visible. Hard substrate life didn't recolonize because the anchors were gone. Bioturbation, the slow churn by worms and holothurians, smoothed edges but didn't rebuild neighborhoods. Millimeters per million years versus months on a grant. The graph lines didn't meet. Noise barely made it into trial summaries, but hydrophones caught it, pump harmonics pulsing down the riser, crawler grind layered with ship machinery. Low frequencies traveled. You didn't need whales on camera to understand the implication. Industrial tone in a habitat tuned to quiet is a curtain you can't draw back between shifts. The fix: mitigation promises, dampers, isolation mounts, better propellers. Helpful, yes, enough to erase a fleet's footprint. No one could show that at trial scale. Then came the tuna overlap work. Not a trial in the narrow sense, but a collision of datasets, mining contract maps and future tuna distribution under warming seas. The models pointed to the CCZ becoming a refuge for big-eye, skipjack, and yellowfin. At the same time, 1.1 million square kilometers of that zone sat under exploration contracts. The trials didn't put hooks in water, but the implication was clear. Plumes and noise in the wrong seasons at the wrong depths could intersect with the economic lifeblood of Pacific states. That's not a slogan, that's the fee that pays nurses in a global tuna industry landing roughly 3.5 million tons a year and worth about $5.5 billion, where access fees can fund up to a third of national budget. Industry tried an end run with carbon claims. One study, commissioned and loudly promoted, suggested lower greenhouse gas emissions per ton of metal from nodules versus rainforest laterites. Another layer was added. Less terrestrial deforestation means fewer carbon sink losses. The counter from scientists was never. It was incomplete. Trials didn't measure carbon feedbacks from plumes keeping particles aloft longer or shifting remineralization up in the water column. They didn't test whether altered mid-water communities change carbon export efficiency. The ledger had missing lines. Transparency was its own trial. Environmental impact assessments for tests came with confidential annexes. Legal and technical commission reviews happened behind closed doors. Independent scientists invited on cruises signed agreements that limited publication timelines or data sharing. When results emerged that complicated the minimal impact narrative, rebuttals shifted to tone. Premature needs more context. We'll learn adaptively. Which sounded reasonable until you remembered that adaptive requires signals you can see quickly. In the deep, the lag is the story. Meanwhile, local trials on land kept intruding. Papua New Guinea's Solwara 1, billed as the first commercial deep-sea mine, collapsed before it truly began bankruptcy, community opposition, unanswered environmental questions. Australia's Northern Territory spent 9 years testing the industry politically and chose a permanent ban. Canada's own laws kept domestic waters closed. If pilots were supposed to build confidence, these case studies did the opposite. They taught parliaments a simple lesson. Cleanup plans look good on paper, and liability is a ghost when harm is far and proof is slow. Back on that deck with the brown film, the biologist bagged samples and logged coordinates. 100 meters away, a contractor's liaison offered coffee and said, "That's why we test, so we can mitigate." She nodded. But mitigation assumes you understand the system you're nudging. Trials showed how much we don't. They also showed something else. Once pumps and PR are both running, the mess isn't just in the water. It's in the gap between what's measured and what's marketed, and that gap is where risk hides. The 2-year rule, Gambit, regulatory countdown. 3 years earlier, in a small office with a big mandate, a letter landed that changed the tempo. Nauru pulled the lever buried in the treaty, the 2-year rule, and told the International Seabed Authority, "Finish the exploitation regulations in 2 years because our sponsored company intends to apply to mine." In a process measured in cautious clauses, a clock suddenly ticked loudly on the wall. Stakes first. For sponsor states like Nauru, Tonga, and Kiribati, this wasn't just procedural theater. It was a pathway to revenue leverage and a seat at a table usually reserved for bigger economies. For contractors, time was money. SPAC horizons, investor patience, and supply agreements hinged on a date, not a debate. For Pacific communities, the clock pointed at tuna grounds and cultural water. For the ISA, it was legitimacy on the line. Could a body tasked with protecting a global commons resist being turned into a rubber stamp by urgency? Action moved quickly by UN standards. Working groups multiplied. Drafts ballooned with brackets, environmental baselines, liability, plume thresholds, adaptive management, benefit sharing. Delegates huddled in side rooms arguing verbs while lawyers traced the architecture of accountability across jurisdictions. Scientists filed memos about knowledge gaps. The deadline hit July 2023. No regulation. The Council acknowledged more time was needed, aiming to finish in 2025 if the text held. The clock didn't produce rules, it produced pressure. Impact showed up in 2 directions. Inside Kingston, the Gambit forced accelerated negotiations. Complex issues that might have matured over years got telescoped into months. Outside, it galvanized opposition. Countries that had been cautious shifted to calling for a moratorium or precautionary pause, citing the IUCN's conditions. Comprehensive risk understanding, transparent assessments, polluter pays, and proof that circular strategies were prioritized. Bans appeared in places with jurisdiction: the Northern Territory in Australia, several US states, Canada's effective bloc in its own waters. The more the clock shouted, the more parliaments reached for breaks. Meanwhile, one detail complicated everything: the ISA's split mission. It must enable access to resources deemed the common heritage of humankind and ensure effective environmental protection. The 2-year rule didn't repeal that second half. It just made the first louder. Contractors framed delay as climate negligence. Delegates from fishing nations countered with food security, pointing to modeling that tuna would shift toward the very grid of exploration contracts in the CCZ under warming seas. If mining's timelines collided with migration seasons, access fees that fund schools and clinics would wobble. That is not a theoretical harm, it's a budget cut. Then came the sharpest test of authority. When a contractor suggested seeking a national license under legacy law to bypass the ISA, the Secretary General warned it would undermine international law and the principle that the seabed beyond national jurisdiction belongs to everyone. That flare told you the clock had moved from pressure tool to fracture risk. If the ISA lost control, the narrative of shared benefit would collapse into a race between flags and exemption. At the heart of the countdown sat the hardest paragraphs: liability and enforcement. If plumes drift beyond modeled halos, who pays? If midwater discharge thins zooplankton and a distant fishery declines, how do you prove causation? The Legal and Technical Commission works in closed sessions. Contractors guard proprietary data. Impacted communities lack the funds to litigate in slow-motion ecosystem. Without a clear liability framework, effective protection is a promise that expires when harm arrives. And yet, the countdown also surfaced better texts. Brackets narrowed around stronger baseline requirements, independent monitoring, and adaptive management triggers tied to thresholds, not trust. Delegates pushed to move the LTC toward more transparency. The Assembly, 169 member states, aired the call for a precautionary pause in full daylight. The rule had intended to compress the future. Instead, it expanded the circle of decision-makers willing to say, "Not yet." Here's the human moment. A Pacific delegate stood in the council and said calmly that their country's budget depends on tuna access fees averaging more than a third of annual revenue, that tuna are shifting east into the CCZ, that any error in plume or noise management would be borne by their children. Across the aisle, a contractor's representative replied that delaying deep-sea mining delays decarbonization and that nodules could lower terrestrial harm. Two truths met. One had a clock behind it, the other had a coastline. In the end, the 2-year rule wasn't just a timer, it was a mirror. It showed who moves on urgency and who moves on evidence, who externalizes risk and who lives with it. The Gambit did what Gambits do, forced a game. The question now is whether a body built to serve all humanity can slow its own pulse long enough to remember why it exists. Who owns the damage? Liability, insurance, and escape hatches. Stakes first. If a plume drifts farther than modeled and a skipjack season collapses, who writes the check? If mid-water discharge thins zooplankton and a clinic in Kiribati loses funding when access fees fall, which desk in Kingston authorizes compensation? The ISA's mandate says effective protection and benefit to humankind. The mining code drafts circle the words liability and redress. But when delegates turn the page to numbers, the ink thins. Action moved to contracts. Every would-be miner must be sponsored by a state which certifies the contractor's compliance and assumes responsibility to ensure. In plain language, if the company fails, the sponsor could be on the hook. That sounds strong until you test it against insolvency. Nautilus Minerals showed the template: promises, debt, bankruptcy, and communities holding letters. A shell company with few assets can fold, leaving lawsuits to chase air. A sponsor state with a smaller GDP than a single processing plant can't backstop a multi-billion-dollar harm. Insurers are the next line in theory. Underwriters prefer risk they can price: frequency, severity, clear causation. Deep-sea mining offers none of those. Plumes move with currents. Impacts materialize years later, proving that a fishery decline came from a discharge 1,000 kilometers up current is a chain of inference, not a car crash. You can buy construction and operational coverage. You can't easily buy a policy that pays Pacific governments for a 10-year tuna slump tied to Twilight Zone disruption. The premium for that uncertainty is either astronomical or unavailable. Impact shows up in the legal architecture. The draft mining code wrestles with strict liability versus fault-based liability. Strict liability says, if damage happens, you pay regardless of negligence. Fault-based says, prove a breach. Industry pushes for the latter. Impacted states need the former. Even with strict liability, you need a pot of money. Proposals include environmental performance bonds, insurance requirements, and a compensation fund financed by royalties. But bonds must be sized to worst case, not average case. Funds must be large enough to matter and accessible without a decade of arbitration. Meanwhile, escape hatches appear in the footnotes. Force majeure clauses excuse performance under unforeseen events, currents, storms, equipment failures. Adaptive management language allows operations to continue while impacts are studied. Confidential annexes hide data that would help a harmed party prove causation. Jurisdictional clauses push disputes into international tribunals that small states can't afford to navigate. Each clause looks reasonable alone. Together, they form a maze. Here's the human version. A fisheries official in Tuvalu opens a spreadsheet and sees a 28% drop in big. She calls colleagues. The pattern holds regionally. There was a mining campaign 2 seasons ago in a contract area upstream of migration routes. She needs data: discharge timing, depth, particle composition, current measurements. The contractor cites confidentiality. The ISA's Legal and Technical Commission reviewed the data in closed session. The official files a request. Months pass. The budget closes with a shortfall. Unknown to them, across town, an underwriter is asking a simpler question. If we sell a policy that pays for ecological harm, can we reinsure it? If not, we cap liability or walk away. Contractors accept caps because lenders demand a clear ceiling. Sponsor states accept caps because they need a project. The cap looks tidy on paper, it looks small next to an ocean. What nobody wants to say plainly is that the common heritage promise dissolves if liability is theoretical. Effective protection requires upfront money parked where victims can reach it, triggers that don't require perfect causation, transparent data to trace harm, and enforcement with teeth. That means independent monitoring controlled by the regulator, open data by default, bonds calibrated to basin scale risk, and a compensation fund sized like a sovereign facility, not a donation jar. There's also the escape hatch floated in frustration. Bypassed the ISA under a national law. The ISA called that unlawful, but the threat revealed another liability hole. If parallel regimes sprout, harmed states face a whack-a-mole of jurisdictions. The only defense is clarity now. No mining beyond national jurisdictions without ISA rules, no approvals without provable financial capacity to remediate, and no confidentiality that blocks harm assessment. Meanwhile, a church elder in Tonga asks a miner's representative one question: if our tuna fail, will you pay our teachers? The representative talks about jobs, global climate goals, and mitigation. The elder nods and waits for a name on a check. Without it, responsible mining is a slogan looking for someone else's wallet. The Clean Future sales pitch promised metals without blood or smoke. Liability is where you learn whether the smoke just moved offshore, thinner, quieter, but just as real when the bill comes due. The alternatives: land reforms, recycling, and new chemistries. While the countdown kept pulsing in Kingston, a quieter race picked up speed, one that doesn't require vacuuming a million years from the seafloor. It starts on land, in law, and in factories that smell like solvents and steel. The question isn't mine or don't mine. It's whether we can cut primary demand fast enough, clean up what we still extract, and buy the time science needs offshore. Stakes first. Pacific treasuries rely on tuna, miners rely on urgency, car makers rely on metals that don't explode their reputations. A portfolio answer speaks to all three. On land, reform isn't a press release, it's maps and enforcement. Draw no-go lines around high biodiversity rainforests and carbon-dense peatlands. Require traceability from pit to cathode. Ban tailings discharge to rivers and coasts. Tie permits to community consent that isn't a signature gathered in the dark. Australia's Northern Territory didn't dodge technology when it banned seabed mining, it weighed livelihoods. The same logic pushes Indonesia and the DRC to lift standards for nickel and cobalt or risk losing the future market entirely. Action looks like procurement muscle. Car companies and grid buyers can refuse laterite nickel fried in coal and cobalt linked to abuse, and they have. Contracts that specify carbon intensity, water use, and labor verification change behavior faster than speeches. If a refinery can't meet the bar, buyers go elsewhere. When buyers stick to the bar, financiers notice. That's not theory, it's how supply chains moved on deforestation, free palm oil, and timber. The difference here is leverage. Batteries are young, growth is steep, and a few large purchasers can swing practice quickly. Meanwhile, recycling stops being a feel-good footnote and becomes feedstock. The first wave was production scrap. The second is end-of-life packs arriving in truckloads. Modern hydrometallurgical plants shred batteries into black mass, then recover nickel, cobalt, and lithium at high yields, refining them back to battery-grade salts. Europe's rules lock in rising recovery and recycled content. U.S. incentives and private capital are scaling domestic plants. China already recycles at massive volumes. The numbers matter. Every ton recovered is a ton not mined, and recovered nickel and cobalt displace the exact metal seabed miners promised. Impact multiplies because scrap begets scrap. Gigafactory yields tighten, but there's always off-spec material. Repair centers swap packs. Consumer electronics keep feeding streams. By the mid-2030s, analysts expect recycled metals to supply a meaningful share of nickel and most cobalt for new batteries in mature markets. That doesn't erase new mining, but it shaves the spike, the crucial decade seabed contractors use as their window. The bridge exists. We need lanes and tolls. Easy cross-border shipment rules for end-of-life packs, designed for disassembly standards, and extended producer responsibility so batteries don't disappear into garages and dumps. Chemistry is the third leg. Not every vehicle needs a 600-mile pack. LFP already proved that with cobalt-free cathodes. Now sodium-ion is moving from pilot to product, especially in entry-level EVs, 2- and 3-wheelers, and grid storage. It trades energy density for cost, safety, and abundance. No cobalt, no nickel. China's largest cell makers have announced mass production. Utilities are building sodium-ion storage stations. The next generation targets energy densities that make short-range cars viable. Stack that with long-cycle LFP for buses and vans, and nickel's demand curve bends down for entire segments. Every chemistry that avoids cobalt and uses less nickel undercuts the argument that the CCZ must open. What nobody tells you when they say we need every source is that portfolios are choices, not fate. Governments can accelerate the shift by setting recycled content mandates, funding city-level battery collection, and fast-tracking permits for low-carbon refineries tied to verified ore. They can also choke the worst pathways. No public money for laterite nickel smelted on captive coal, no import access for batteries without chain of custody. Standards don't slow innovation, they point it. There's a human loop here too. When a Pacific minister says their budget relies on tuna, a battery buyer can hear it as risk. That risk translates into avoided headlines and resilient supply. Choose sodium in a fleet that doesn't need long range. Specify recycled nickel in the next model line. Partner with recyclers near assembly plants to keep materials local. Suddenly, security of supply looks like warehouses and laboratories, not a crawler half an ocean away. Meanwhile, scientists keep mapping the deep on time that doesn't fit quarterly calls. The alternatives buy them years. Every pack designed for second life keeps metals in circulation longer. Every percentage point of recovery pushed through hydromet plants reduces pressure on new pits. Every municipal program that pulls dead scooters and laptops into regulated streams feeds black mass trains headed to refineries that already exist. It's not glamorous, it's adult. Is there a catch? Always. Recycling economics wobble with metal prices. Sodium ion still has to prove durability in harsh cycles. Traceability systems can be gamed, but those are tractable problems with levers we control. You can't negotiate with a plume once it leaves a discharge port. You can write a purchase order that shifts a market in 6 months. So the alternative isn't a handbrake on the transition. It's the transition done with less collateral, law that cleans up the worst mines, factories that turn waste back into supply, and chemistries that skip the metals we fight over. The green story doesn't need a vacuum in the abyss. It needs a plan that treats scarcity as a design brief, not a sales pitch. The geopolitics, China, supply chains, and leverage. While Pacific ministers argue for time, another tide moves beneath them. Who controls the metals, the processing, and the story? For the last decade, China built the middle of the battery world. Refineries, cathode plants, black mass recyclers, links that turn ore and scrap into cells. By now, most lithium and cobalt flows cross a Chinese port or a Chinese ledger before they become a battery. That's not a slogan. It's a map of where value is added and where leverage lives. Stakes first. Governments staring at climate targets don't just worry about metal tonnage, they worry about choke points. If a single policy in Beijing can tighten exports of graphite or nickel sulfate, assembly lines in Stuttgart and Michigan feel it in weeks. If war or weather slows a trade lane, delivery dates slip and headlines bloom. In that anxiety, seabed metals look like a geopolitical fix: diversify sources, blunt dependence, and signal sovereignty. Contractors know this. Their decks don't just sell nodules, they sell freedom. Action looks like ministerial briefings with 2 columns. On the left, today's reality. Australia ships spodumene to China, DRC cobalt goes to Chinese refineries, gigafactories in Europe and the US still import midstream materials from Asia. China dominates magnet supply for motors. On the right, promised pivots, domestic refineries, friend-shored inputs, recycled feedstock, alternative chemistries that skip scarce metal. Deep sea mining slides into the middle as a hedge, an oceanic source that on paper bypasses contested ground. Impact lands in boardrooms. Automakers negotiating cathode supply know who holds the cards. They sign long contracts, accept take or pay clauses, and pray the policy winds don't flip. Some hedge by funding refineries in allied countries, others by betting on LFP or sodium ion to cut cobalt and high nickel exposure. The more those bets pay off, the less persuasive the open the ocean pitch becomes. Diversification within chemistry is a geopolitical move. If a car segment runs on sodium and LFP, a single export control can't shut it down. Meanwhile, Beijing reads the same charts. If seabed metals threaten midstream leverage, expect counter moves, invest in contractors, finance sponsor states, or accelerate recycling throughput to make ocean or less relevant. China's edge isn't just mines, it's process know-how at scale, how to turn black mass into battery-grade salts reliably, cheaply, and cleanly enough to pass buyers' audits. That's a moat built on engineers, not bulldozers. An ocean crawler doesn't cross it alone. Here's where seabed mining's geopolitics get messy. If the ISA stays firm, any metal from the area must move under a regime that spreads benefits and enforces environmental protection. If a contractor or a country tries a national workaround, the system fractures into flags, lawsuits, and gray markets. That's not resilience, that's confusion you can't insure. Investors shy from legal fog. buyers shy from reputational smoke. The same urgency that makes ministers reach for a hedge can, if mishandled, turn into a tariff target and a customs headache. What nobody says aloud in those closed briefings: ocean metals don't dissolve midstream reality. Nodules still have to sail to refineries. Where are those? Today, mostly in China. Building low-carbon refining elsewhere takes years, permits, skilled labor, and steady policy. If you lift nodules only to ship them to the same bottleneck, you didn't solve dependence. You deepened it with ecological risk attached. Meanwhile, smaller states find themselves as leverage points. Sponsor a contractor and you're courted by capitals, promised royalties courted by rivals. A vote in Kingston becomes a bargaining chip in broader relationships: aid, climate finance, fisheries access. That's power, but it's precarious. One administration signs, the next inherits liability if harm surfaces and the company folds. In great power games, small states often get invited to the opening and left out of the credit. There's another lane: recycling as strategy. Europe sets strict recovery and recycled content rules. North America throws subsidies and loans at domestic plants. Asian giants expand already massive capacity. Scrap flows become a new trade, governed less by geology than by logistics and regulation. A country that organizes collection, streamlines cross-border shipments, and seeds hydromet plants close to gigafactories can claw back leverage fast. It's not glamorous, but 1,000 trucks of end-of-life packs can do what one ship of nodules can't: feed refineries you control. Add the magnet question. Rare earths sit outside the seabed nodule story, yet they anchor motors and wind turbines. China's dominance in magnet manufacturing compounds leverage. Some countries pivot to motor designs that cut rare earth use. Others build magnet plants with allied inputs. The pattern holds: redesign to reduce exposure, recycle to feed domestic loops, refine outside single points of control. Seabed mining doesn't touch that core problem, so the geopolitical truth is less cinematic than a crawler at dawn. Power sits in process expertise, regulation, and purchase orders. The fastest path away from dependency is not a new frontier, it's a new center: refining and recycling hubs tied to strict standards, chemistries that diversify risk, and procurement that rewards clean, traceable supply. If deep-sea mining enters that world before the rules are real, it won't break China's grip. It'll add a fragile stream to an existing river, with a plume attached. The human cost: islands, fishers, and future generations. Dawn in Funafuti starts with a diesel hum and a chorus of roosters. On the pier, Lanny's hands move on habit: knots, hooks, a glance at the tide line painted on seawall concrete. Her father marked that line in 1992, a pencil scratch at eye level. Today, the sea kisses it at spring tides. The boat she crews chases skipjack. The access fees those fish bring pay nurses, salaries, and keep lights on at the primary school. In a ledger far away, it's a revenue stream. In her house, it's school shoes. Meanwhile, something else is happening in the language of children. On a Wednesday in Kiribati, a class practices a dance for their Independence Day. The teacher pauses to remind them why the ocean word matters: Tiaba, the land, and Timona, the sea, as one story. The dance steps trace canoe roots their grandparents' name. A crawler's track doesn't show up in that book, but a thin season does. When bait arrives late, when a cannery cuts shifts, when a government delays a clinic renovation because an access payment fell short. Get this, tuna is not romance here, it's payroll. In several Pacific states, fees from foreign fleets fishing their waters make up a third, sometimes more, of annual budgets. Scientists project that big eye, skipjack, and yellowfin are shifting east as the Pacific warms. The same maps show deep-sea mining contracts laid like lattice across the zone those fish may favor. That overlap isn't a diagram, it's a risk with names. Sira, who runs the market stall in Nuku'alofa. Jope, a deckhand who sends remittances home to Vanuatu. A season that dips isn't an abstract stock fluctuation. It's a rent payment that slides past due. In Madang, Papua New Guinea, Jonathan still keeps the letter his community sent in 2019, asking their government to cancel Nautilus's seabed licenses. They had watched the promises accumulate: jobs, training, world-leading safeguards, and then watched the company collapse, leaving behind uncertainty and a bill. It taught a blunt lesson: when a venture folds, the ocean stays, and so do the people who depend on it. Their liability is lived, not litigated. Across the ocean, a different household hears the cost as static. Mara in San Diego works nights at a cannery that seasons, seals, and ships tuna to supermarkets stateside. The belt slows when shipments thin, supervisors shuffle hours. She doesn't know what the Clarion-Clipperton zone is. She knows her mortgage rate and the price of gas. If mid-water discharge thins the twilight zone food web and tuna veer off, that shock won't show as a headline about mining. It'll show as a pink slip taped to a time clock. Here, where culture and cash hold each other up. The ocean is inheritance. Graves tended on atolls, songs that define reefs by their sound, elders who teach where to cast by reading wind on a lagoon's skin. It's also infrastructure, scholarship funds from access fees, ferries that carry kids to high school, weather stations that warn of cyclones. When leaders in Vanuatu or the Solomons weigh sponsorship offers, they sit between two councils. One counts dollars, one counts obligations to ancestors and to grandchildren not yet named. Meanwhile, the mental load settles quietly. A mother in Tarawa wakes to a high-tide flood creeping across her floor. She lifts a mattress, texts her sister, checks whether the clinic has clean water today. If she hears of mining at 4,000 meters, it's as a rumor linking faraway machines to fish that feel thinner. The science is careful, the cause and effect is fogged. But in a life already squeezed by sea level rise, any new uncertainty reads as harm. The church halls turn into parliaments of care. After Sunday service in Tonga, a meeting fills with fishers, teachers, and ministers. A young man argues that royalties could fund a new vocational school. An elder answers softly, "A school built on a risk we can't control is a debt our grandchildren will pay." Heads nod, not because they hate industry, but because trust has to be earned where enforcement is thin and past promises blew away like chaff. Unknown to them, across town, a consultant is building a model that prices acceptable impact. It holds no column for a lullaby that names a reef, or for a child who chooses to leave because fishing feels too uncertain. Those aren't inputs, but they are costs, so the human math is simple and heavy. Plumes and noise, if misjudged, don't land on a P and L, they land on meal plans, clinic rosters, school rosters. A precautionary pause isn't an abstract principle, it's a breathing space for communities whose margins are thin and whose ties to the sea are not optional. A miner's delay is an investor's annoyance. A fisher's failed season is a family's hunger. Lanny pushes off from the pier. The diesel coughs, then evens out. She looks back at the seawall line her father marked and thinks about drawing another higher. Her nephew waves from the concrete, a plastic bucket in one hand, a tinny radio in the other playing a song about home. The boat noses toward the pass, into a channel her grandparents named for its color. Out there, decisions made in rooms without windows will meet water that keeps its own books. The children waiting on shore will balance them. 14, the burden of proof. Precaution versus promise. 3 weeks after that church meeting in Tonga, a draft slid across a delegate's desk in Kingston with one line that carried the weight of an ocean. Operations may proceed provided no serious harm is expected. Expected by whom? Modeled with what? In a place where plumes move like weather and recovery runs on geologic time, expectation is a soft net for a hard catch. Stakes first. Industry comes with a promise. Faster decarbonization, fewer rainforest scars, shared benefits for sponsor states. Communities arrive with a simpler ask. Don't gamble the food chain that funds our hospitals. The law sits between them. The seabed beyond borders is the common heritage of humankind, which means the burden of proof can't rest on the people most exposed to uncertainty. If you can't show safety, you wait. That's the precautionary principle in plain clothes. Action looks like thresholds tied to evidence, not optimism. Before any commercial fleet deploys, independent baselines must do more than map a square of seafloor. They have to trace midwater life across seasons, track sound across basins, and quantify how far finds travel in real currents. Monitoring can't be a contractor's camera in a contractor's grid. It needs regulator-controlled sensors streaming open data, with tripwires that stop operations automatically when plumes or noise cross agreed lines. This isn't mistrust. It's governance that knows time in the deep moves slowly and accountability on land moves faster when dashboards are public. What nobody in the promise column wants to dwell on is lag. A discharge today could thin zooplankton that feed lanternfish next month, which feed tuna the season after, which pay nurses next year. By the time an impact shows up in a budget, the crawler has logged 1,000 more kilometers, and the insurance adjuster is asking for proof you can't collect retroactively. Precaution is a design choice that bakes lag into rules. Strict liability, big bonds sized to basin-scale risk, and the right to shut valves first and litigate later. Meanwhile, promise asks for trust in adaptive management. Monitor, learn, tweak, continue. It works in systems that answer quickly. In the abyss, feedback is a whisper. If the only leverage you have is the contractor's willingness to throttle back after a quarterly call, you didn't build a safety system. You wrote a letter of intent. Precaution flips the presumption. The crawler earns its hours by clearing thresholds, not by assuring you it will. There's a second burden the promise camp rarely carries: alternatives. If a company claims nodules are essential, the proof isn't a slide of projected demand. It's a portfolio analysis that shows recycled nickel and cobalt maxed out, sodium ion deployed where range isn't king, and low-carbon refineries online outside the same choke points. IUCN's conditions say the quiet part loud. Don't open a frontier until you've tried the tools that cut demand and clean supply. Promise without that homework is marketing. Impact becomes visible when you cost risk honestly. A compensation fund filled by royalties sounds prudent until you price a fishery shock that drains a third of a nation's budget. A bond that covers bent pipes and fouled pumps won't touch a decade of diminished catches. Precaution sizes money to harm you can't unspool, and it keeps that money where claimants can reach it without spending their treasury on arbitration. That's not anti-business. That's how you do business where failure is slow and wide. Here, S where the human voice returns. A minister from a small island rises and says, "We don't ask for zero risk, we ask for the burden to sit with those who profit, not with those who feed their children from these waters." Across the room, a contractor replies, "Delay has costs, coal burns while you hesitate." The chair lets the silence hold. Both sentences carry truth. Only one asks others to absorb uncertainty they didn't create. The test runs through language. No serious harm becomes no harm we can't see yet. Acceptable impact becomes impact our neighbors will pay for. Precaution edits those sentences. It says, measure first at scales that match the ocean, prove you can stop on a dime when thresholds break, fund the worst case as if it might arrive, and show that every near-term alternative is already running hot. Then, and only then, ask a family on a pier to share your promise. The $15 trillion number. Value, hype, and speculation. Here, S where the billboard number shows up, $15 trillion. It is cash in a vault. It's a spreadsheet fantasy, metal in ground times optimistic prices minus reality. No discount for risk, regulation, liability, or time. Perfect chemistry, perfect markets, perfect politics. It sells urgency. It isn't value, it's leverage dressed as destiny. How does a number like that work in the wild? First, it migrates from a back-of-envelope estimate into glossy decks and media headlines. Trillions in untapped metals becomes proof of inevitability. Second, it colonizes policy briefings. If the seabed holds $15 trillion, then the national interest is to move first, regulate later. Third, it shows up in investor pitches as implied collateral, vast resources that will one day become reserves. Once the rules are kind and the science is quiet. What's missing from that arithmetic? Risk, discount rates that reflect nonlinear ecological harm and political backlash aren't applied. Recovery, not all metal in nodules becomes metal in markets. Recovery factors, downtime, and supply chain bottlenecks shrink real value. Liability, funds to cover fisheries shocks in a $5.5 billion global tuna sector don't show up as costs. Substitution, chemistry shifts, LFP, sodium ion, and recycling gains erode demand for the very metals the number counts on. Governance, delays, moratoria, and bans, like the Northern Territory. S, after 9 years of scrutiny, stretch timelines and crush NPV. The headline figure is a narrative tool. It's waved in front of ministers whose budgets depend on tuna access fees and in front of investors who will never have to balance a school ledger in Funafuti. If you price the real world, carbon, courts, communities, the trillions shrink fast. What should happen now? A realistic path. Start with a voice, not a valve. Picture a finance minister in Kiribati holding two memos. One promises royalties from nodules someday. The other shows a budget where a third of revenue comes from tuna access fees right now in a $5.5 billion global industry that lands roughly 3.5 million tons a year. She doesn't need slogans, she needs certainty. Now start with the clock. Not the one Nauru set, the one families live by. The next 5 to 15 years are the squeeze. EV demand surges, recycling feedstock ramps but isn't mature, and Pacific budgets hinge on tuna that may be shifting east into contract grids. The path that respects both urgency and uncertainty isn't a bet on abyssal vacuuming. It's a build, policy, plants, and proofs sequence to buy time without burning trust. First, lock the pause with teeth. Call it a moratorium, call it a precautionary pause. What matters is criteria that aren't vibes. No commercial deep-sea mining until independent baselines at scale are complete across seafloor and mid-water. Until open data monitoring systems are deployed and governed by the regulator, not contractors. Until strict liability rules and basin-scale bonds are in place. And until a compensation fund, capitalized to cover multi-year fishery shocks, is established and accessible. IUCN already laid out the backbone. Risk comprehensively understood, rigorous transparent assessments, polluter pays, and proof that circular strategies are prioritized. Put dates on the science, not on a start line. Second, move fast where risk is known and levers are close, recycling and design. Mandate recycled content ramp-ups for nickel, cobalt, and lithium in batteries sold in major markets. Tie them to recovery targets that match the best commercial plants today and ratchet up on a schedule. Fund city-to-plant logistics, safe collection points, standardized transport permits across borders, and incentives that pull end-of-life packs out of garages and scrap heaps into regulated streams. Require design for disassembly in battery and pack architectures. Fewer glues, more fasteners, clearer labeling, so reclaiming materials is cheaper and safer. Every ton of black mass that hits a hydromet line this decade cuts into the "we need nodules now" plea. Third, treat chemistry as policy. For segments that don't need long-range, fleets, buses, urban cars, 2- and 3-wheelers, set procurement standards that privilege LFP and sodium ion where fit for purpose and backstop them with warranties and financing. Public fleets can anchor demand. Utilities can tender storage that favors sodium ion for cost and safety. This isn't picking winners forever. It's matching use cases to chemistries that cut cobalt and nickel exposure right now. It's also a signal to cathode makers. Diversify or lose orders. Fourth, clean up the mines we still need. Draw real no-go zones around high biodiversity forests and peatlands. Ban riverine and marine tailings dumping. Enforce water and air standards with third-party audits visible to buyers. Tie import access in large markets to verifiable chain of custody and labor standards. Buyers, automakers, storage developers should bake carbon intensity and human rights criteria into long-term contracts. If a smelter runs on captive coal, the price reflects it, or the contract moves. That shifts practice faster than speeches, and it undercuts the lesser evil marketing that points at the rainforest and then at a crawler. And get specific. Penalize nickel roots that emit on the order of 7-9. 4 kg cotui per kg of metal because of land use change and dirty processing, and cut exposure to cobalt streams from the DRC, which still supply roughly 75% of the world's cobalt and carry high social risk without strict traceability. Fifth, build midstream where the dependence lives. Refining and precursor capacity outside single choke points isn't an op-ed. It's permits, grants, and offtakes. Fast-track low-carbon refineries near gigafactories with environmental guardrails as strong as the financing, and pair them with co-located recycling so scrap loops shorten. Public money should flow where private contracts commit. Conditional loans that unlock when offtake agreements hit recycled content floors. The same logic applies to magnet supply. Invest in alternatives and recycling while tightening design standards that cut rare earth intensity. Sixth, get honest about tuna. Regional fisheries bodies and the ISA need a standing joint task group with authority, not just dialogue. Map seasons, depths, and migration corridors against any activity window and build hard exclusions into any future regime. No discharges into depths that intersect the twilight zone during spawning and migration peaks. No operations in LICAs, areas critical to fisheries, without verifiable zero-impact protocol. If a model says overlap risk rises, operations pause. Food security isn't a footnote, it's the line item that keeps states functioning. Seventh, fix transparency before you test trust again. Open LTC deliberations where possible, publish EIAs and their annexes, require raw environmental data deposition in public repositories on timelines that matter. Put independent observers, not paid by contractors, on ships with a mandate to stream basic telemetry. Discharge depths, flow rates, noise signatures, plume sensors. If the science is the foundation, hiding it is demolition. Eighth, price risk like adults. Set environmental performance bonds at scales that contemplate basin-wide harm, not broken pumps. Capitalize a compensation facility from the first dollar of any ocean-related revenue streams, application fees, royalties, so it exists before harm does. Make payouts trigger on thresholds tied to ecological indicators and economic impacts, with burden of proof rules that don't demand impossible precision from small state. Ninth, align finance with the portfolio. Development banks and export credit agencies should stop funding laterite nickel baked in coal and start backing recycling plants, low-carbon refineries, and sodium-ion manufacturing. Private capital follows de-risked pathways, stable policy, long offtakes, and clear standards. If an IPO deck leans on first mover, ocean rhetoric without the regulatory criteria met, exchanges and institutional investors should read it as a red flag, not an opportunity. Finally, keep the human front and center. Build revenue hedges for Pacific budgets now, climate finance tied to fisheries resilience, diversified local value-add in tuna supply chains, and contingency funds that bridge lean seasons. When sponsor-state negotiations happen, seat communities, fishers, and women's groups at the table, not as consultation, but as consent. A royalty promise means little if the school roof still leaks. None of this is glamorous. It's welding lines, boring meetings, and dashboards that light up when thresholds are crossed. But that's how you run a transition that doesn't export its mess to places that can't afford it. The ocean can wait while we do the grown-up work on land, tighten loops, change recipes, and lift standards, until the day we can say with evidence that a crawler won't steal food from a child or silence a song a family sings to name a reef. If we can't say that, we aren't ready. Resolution and broader meaning. In the end, the choice isn't metals or oceans, it's panic or craft, shortcuts or stewardship. If we treat scarcity as a design brief, we don't need to gamble a million-year habitat to solve a decade-long bottleneck. Want more of these unvarnished stories that follow the money and the people it touches? Subscribe now and watch the next film on how recycling quietly rewrites the supply map without leaving a plume in the twilight.